They're still looking for somewhere to sit. Glad to have you all here. My name is Dan Johnson-Smatowski. I am the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and Craft Film Professor of Jewish-Christian Relations here at Boston College. And I'm pleased to welcome you all here to this event, whether you are in person or online. And it's a real pleasure for us to have Professor Matthew Thiessen with us tonight. And so just a little note on how we will proceed. Professor Thiessen will offer his talk. He says it's about 35 to 40 minutes. We'll see if he sticks to that. But he has PowerPoint to keep him on track. And after that talk, we'll open the floor for questions and conversation, both for those in person. We'll have a microphone for you, and I'll be fielding questions via the chat online. And I'll be tracking all those questions and making sure they get asked. So please let me introduce our speaker. Matthew Thiessen is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Before that, he taught at our sister university, St. Louis University, so we're glad to have that pedigree in the house. He studies the origins of Christianity within Ancient Judaism. He's the author of numerous books: Paul and the Gentile Problem, Jesus and the Forces of Death, and Contesting Conversion, Genealogy, Circumcision, and Identity in Late Ancient Judaism and Christianity. That last book won the Manfred Lautenschlaeger Award for Theological Promise. And so Professor Thiessen is with us tonight to offer a presentation derived from his newest book, which is available in the back along with some of the others, A Jewish Paul, the Messiah's Herald to the Gentiles. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Thiessen.
Let me begin by expressing what an honor it is for me to be here with you. I received my doctorate at Duke University, and so in relation to ACC football and ACC basketball, we are rivals. In relation to the commitment to academic excellence embodied by Boston College, and the commitment to Jewish and Christian relations embodied especially here at BC Center for Christian Jewish Learning, I have long been a deep admirer. So I want to thank the Center and its director for the opportunity to speak here tonight. My talk, entitled A Jewish Paul, Restoring the Apostle Paul to His Roots, will provide an overview on the question of the Apostle Paul and his relationship to Judaism, highlighting a relatively new and growing scholarly trend that seeks to resituate Paul not against Judaism, but within it. It is my conviction that this is an important moment in Pauline scholarship. Actually, also an important historical moment, again, with the re-rising of anti-Semitism in our world. And it's a moment that's far too important to be left to the narrow confines of academia, but something that must be made known to clergy and lay people, not just scholars in our offices, libraries, and classrooms. That's unimportant. For it remains almost commonplace for people partially familiar with Paul's writings, even very familiar with Paul's writings, to believe that he rejected Judaism and joined or even created a new religion called Christianity, and that this new religion, Christianity, was something deeply opposed to Judaism. In fact, as recently as 2021, 3 years ago, a scholar of religion could claim that the Apostle Paul was a malevolent assailant against both Jews and Judaism, who spread a message of hate. Ultimately, this scholar concludes, Paul was responsible for laying the groundwork for 2 millennia of Christian anti-Semitism. Those are bold claims, and I don't think they're uncommon. Similar understandings of Paul go back to the very earliest claims we have from others about him. The author of the Acts of the Apostles, writing sometime towards the end of the 1st century or early in the 2nd century CE, depicts some of Paul's contemporaries warning other Jews at the Jerusalem temple in the following words. "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, in this place, the temple. More than that, he has actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." Such rumors about Paul had, according to Luke, made their way already to the Jewish believers in Jesus who were living in in Jerusalem. So when Paul arrives in town, the Jerusalem apostles take him aside and warn him that others have heard that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to abandon Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or to observe the customs, Jewish customs. These claims found within the narrative of Acts of the Apostles are, to the author of Luke, false accusations against and misunderstandings of Paul and his message. In contrast to these accusations, both Paul and the Jerusalem apostles believe that Paul continues to be a faithful Jew who observes the law. After acknowledging that Jewish believers in Jesus have been hearing negative rumors about Paul, they clarify that they themselves know Paul submits to and keeps the law. And after Paul is arrested on the false charge that he has defiled the Jerusalem temple, Paul defends himself emphatically. "Neither against the law of the Jews nor against the temple have I sinned." And even at the very end of the Acts of the Apostles, Paul evokes and answers the accusations of Acts 21, telling the Jews there in Rome, "I have done nothing against the Jewish people or against the customs of our ancestors." What the Acts of the Apostles shows us is that pretty much from the moment Paul penned his letters, people wrestled the implications of his statements in those letters for Paul's relationship to his Jewishness. So scholars will debate the history, the historical value of Acts of the Apostles, but even still it shows you there are these rumors floating around out there from very early on. And Luke at least thinks people are really misunderstanding the Apostle Paul. Quite quickly, Christian readers almost universally concluded that Paul had abandoned Judaism. So, for instance, we hear the church father Tertullian claim the primary epistle against Judaism is that addressed to the Galatians. And this view predominated as Christians found themselves in conflict with Jews over the interpretation of scriptures and in competition with them over matters of identity. Who were the true and faithful people of God? Who was the true Israel? That theological instinct to construct Christian identity in opposition to Jewish identity continues to dominate even in supposedly objective historical critical scholarship on the Apostle Paul. So, for instance, the main reading of the Apostle Paul since the Protestant Reformation can be characterized as an anti-legalistic reading of Paul that goes back especially to the theology of Martin Luther. Those holding to this reading often assert that Judaism required people to keep the Jewish law perfectly in order to participate in God's salvation. At the same time, such interpreters generally maintain that the Jewish law was impossible to do perfectly. Despite this fact, so this reading goes, there were some Jews who only convinced themselves of their ability to keep the law perfectly, and thus became guilty of self-deluded pride. In contrast, there were other Jews who were more honest with their own shortcomings and saw that they did not and could not keep the law. For such Jews, again according to this reading, the result was nothing but despair. Paul's problem with Judaism, then, was that it required people to earn their salvation through good works. And in contrast, in this reading, Paul preached a gospel of faith in Christ Jesus apart from human works. As Martin Luther asserted, you can see this in the last line on the slide, Paul shuts out the Jews and all who will work for their salvation. They're damned. It doesn't take much reflection to see that Luther's construction of Paul and Judaism maps quite well, perhaps maybe shockingly well, suspiciously well, onto his own perceptions of the Roman Catholicism of his day, which Luther believed required humans to earn their salvation in contrast to his own gospel that stressed divine grace in faith in Christ. Despite the rise of historical critical scholarship on the New Testament, Luther's view of Paul and Judaism continued to sort of rule the day. Rudolf Bultmann, one of the leading New Testament scholars of the 20th century, argued that trying to observe the Jewish law, and I quote, seriously meant making life an intolerable burden. It was almost impossible to know the rules, let alone put them into practice. The Apostle Paul sought to free people from slavery to the Jewish law. Likewise, another German New Testament theologian, Ernst Käsemann, could claim, and again I quote, the Apostle's message of justification is a fighting doctrine, directed against Judaism. This Lutheran take, unsurprisingly, dominated German scholarship, but it was also quite common in the English-speaking world. Richard Bell, a British scholar, puts Paul's thinking this way. If the Jew fulfills the law from A to Z, that is one of the gravest sins he could commit, in Paul's mind. For the pious Jew that boasts in his performance and feels he has a claim upon God. So for Bell, in his reading of Paul, Jews are damned if they don't do the law perfectly, and they're damned if they do the law perfectly. There's both ways they're not trusting God. Okay? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. In this reading, Paul then abandons a Judaism that views God as a harsh isn't the right word, impossible and unfair taskmaster, requiring the impossible of humans. Paul comes with the gospel of God's free gift of grace for humans, something that, for this reading, undermined the essence of Judaism. But in 1977, this whole stream of scholarship on Paul came under vigorous scrutiny in the work of one of my predecessors at McMaster University, E.P. Sanders. In his work, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, a comparison of patterns of religion, Sanders demonstrated convincingly, by not looking to Paul, but by actually looking at early Jewish sources. How else do you find out what ancient Jews believed? Apart from asking them or the text they wrote 2,000 years ago. Sanders demonstrated convincingly that ancient Jews believed that their God was gracious, and that this gracious election of Israel preceded any human response to God. Sanders called this thinking covenantal nomism. God sets up a gracious and loving covenant with Israel, and Israel's grateful response is shown through law observance. It doesn't have to be perfect, but that's just how you respond in gratitude. This landmark book threatened to shape the very foundations of New Testament scholarship, as well as Christian theology. If Paul did not differentiate his message from Judaism on the basis of a dichotomy of faith and grace on the one hand, and human works on the other, then what was the difference between Judaism and Christianity? As a result, some New Testament scholars sought to reframe Paul's problem with Judaism. If Judaism wasn't a religion of works righteousness and legalism, what was its problem? You can see the assumption there's got to be a problem. Two British scholars, James Dunn and Tom Wright, argued that Paul's primary criticism of Judaism was that it was ethnocentric and exclusivistic. While Jews did not think that they needed to keep the law perfectly, they did believe, according to this reading, that God had elected them and had given them the law in order to set them apart from other nations. And consequently, the observance of the Jewish law, particularly circumcision, Sabbath, and dietary laws, functioned as identity badges that distinguished Jews from non-Jews. In the readings of Dunn and Wright, Judaism insisted that Gentiles could only enjoy the covenantal benefits that Jews possessed by undergoing circumcision and adoption of the Jewish law. Gentiles could only please God by becoming Jews. Both Dunn and Wright compare this construction of Judaism that they've put forward to the sorts of colonizing practices of European Christians. It was this ethnocentricity, according to Dunn and Wright, that Paul resisted, preaching a gospel that was free from the observance of such distinctly Jewish practices. The anti-legalistic and anti-ethnocentric readings of Paul are the two major competing scholarly accounts. But while they vie with one another, and admittedly mostly in Protestant circles, they actually share a similar structure. Central to both readings of Paul is that there is something fundamentally wrong about Judaism that Paul in his message respond to and fix. For the anti-legalist reading of Paul, Judaism was a religion with a view of God that was devoid of grace and required humans to pull themselves up by their moral bootstraps in order to impress and thus win over an otherwise uncharitable God. For the anti-ethnocentric reading of Paul, Judaism was all about race or ethnicity and couldn't conceive of the possibility that God might also save non-Jews unless they became Jews. Paul's gospel, in contrast to these constructions of Judaism, stressed that God was a gracious God, extending salvation apart from human worth. Where Paul's gospel, in supposed contrast to and rejection of Judaism, stressed, in Tom Wright's words, grace, not race. It's his words, grace, not race. Whereas Judaism was ethnocentric and exclusivistic, Pauline Christianity was inclusive and universalistic. Like a jeweler who places her diamonds on black velvet, such readings contrast Paul to Judaism in an effort to set off the splendor of Paul and his thought, and ultimately Christianity, against the dark backdrop of a Judaism devoid of grace, or a religion closed and unkind. As Matt Novenson has observed, most Protestant theologies of Paul require a foe for the apostle to vanquish, and most have made Judaism play a part of that foe. But are such readings of ancient Judaism accurate? Are they fair? And are such readings ethical and charitable? On the question of accuracy, the clear answer is a resounding no. In an impressive study of grace in early Judaism, and the Apostle Paul that builds on the work of E.B. Sanders, John Barclay rightly observes that after studying grace in a number of ancient Jewish texts, grace is everywhere in Second Temple Judaism, but not everywhere the same. Paul stands in the midst of this diversity. His theology of grace does not stand in antithesis to Judaism, but neither is there a common Jewish view with which it wholly coincides. And on the morality of such readings and their accuracy, again the answer is a resounding no. Speaking of Jesus, but equally applicable to the study of Paul in Judaism, Paula Fredrickson notes that contrasting an ethnocentric and exclusivistic Judaism to an egalitarian gospel isn't history, nor is it realistic description. It is caricature, generated by abstractions, whereby a set of politically and ethically pleasant attributes define Jesus, or Paul, egalitarian, caring, ethic-directed, and so on, and negatively, the majority of his Jewish contemporaries. Such readings delve into more apologetics than they do into history. Historically, most interpreters have understood Paul's gospel to lie outside of Judaism and against the fundamental theological principles of Judaism, however defined. And so they have depicted Paul as a radical Jew, or an anomalous Jew, or even a former Jew. But a small and growing number of scholars are now seeking to situate Paul not against Judaism, but within it. This camp of interpreters began in the work of John Gager and Lloyd Gaston in the 1990s, but really built momentum in the last 15 years in the works of scholars, to name just a few, such as Pamela Eisenbaum, Mark Nanos, Magnus Setterholm, Paula Fredrickson, and well, I may as well throw myself in here too. What each of these scholars has sought to uncover is a law-observant Jew, a law-observant Paul, who follows Jesus the Messiah. In short, a Jewish Paul, not a radical Jew, or an anomalous Jew, or a former Jew, just one Jew, living his life and following his perceived calling in the ancient Mediterranean world. In the remainder of our time here, I want to focus on what I think are three central arguments that help us to reclaim a Jewish Paul. We could dive into the nitty-gritties, but I might bore you. I would definitely bore my children. So I'll try to give sort of a bird's eye view of what I think are important sort of assumptions that guide those who want to read Paul within Judaism. First, central to any accurate understanding of Paul is an awareness of the diversity of early Judaism. Second, we must start with all the evidence of the Jewishness of Paul's letters. What are we prioritizing when we read Paul, in other words? And third, we must read Paul's letters in relation to his self-understanding as the divinely appointed apostle or envoy of the Messiah to non-Jews, to Gentiles. First and fundamental to any study of Paul or Jesus or ancient Judaism is a thoroughgoing reckoning with the existence of considerable religious diversity in ancient Judaism. You have to know your sources. You have to know what you're comparing Paul to. And you can only do that by reading ancient Jewish texts. Judaism doesn't believe anything, but Jews do. Judaism doesn't do anything, but Jews do. Judaism doesn't have a mind to think or a voice to speak or a body to act, but Jews do. When we speak of Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism or Islam or atheism, we are using an abstraction. We all do this. Judaism is a name that collects all individual Jews, perhaps even down through time, and puts them into one category. In doing so, inevitably leads to generalizations and oversimplification. We know this from our own time and world. We know that diversity exists within Judaism today, in, for instance, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism, and in Christianity's major branches of Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. Who gets to decide who is a Jew and who isn't? Who gets to decide what constitutes good Jewish or bad Jewish behavior, or true or false Jewish belief? There was and is no Jewish equivalent to the Pope, after all. In this regard, Jews are more like Mennonites, my own little branch of Christianity, than they are like Roman Catholics. You Roman Catholics will also know that just because the Pope says something doesn't mean it's without controversy. So even that isn't the greatest example. The figure of Moses perhaps comes closest to a Pope-like figure, but in the first century CE, different Jewish leaders and interpreters of Moses existed. Whether it be the high priest or the Sanhedrin or the Herodian dynasty or the Essenes, who got to decide whose reading was right? The Essenes had their teacher of righteousness. Others followed John the Dunker. Within the movement of the Pharisees, some appealed to Rabbi Hillel and others appealed to Rabbi Shammai. And another group followed a Galilean teacher named Jesus. None of these figures was universally perceived to be the final and authoritative voice for all Jews, or for Judaism. Ancient Jews debated who had authority and how to construct Jewish identity and the right legal positions on a whole host of different topics. And once we recognize that ancient Judaism was very diverse, we can begin to see some of the false assumptions that we might entertain about Jesus and Paul, and the rise of what, at some point, became Christianity. If Jews held different opinions on many, if not all topics, and if Jews lived out their identity differently from one another, then we can't simply know with any certainty that Paul's belief on this or that topic or particular behavior meant he broke away from Judaism. Think about this statement Paul makes about his life before Jesus was revealed to him. This is the New Revised Standard Version. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the Church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. Many readers of this text have taken these verses to demonstrate that Paul abandoned the religion of Judaism. Given what the NRSV and most other modern translations what they do with Paul's Greek here, I don't entirely blame them. But what would it have looked like? So there are some translational issues that I would challenge, and we can talk about that at some other point, I won't do it here. But what would it have looked like for Paul to abandon Judaism? Was he kicked out? If so, by whom? Or did he come to believe that he had left Judaism regardless of what others thought? Did Paul believe that he had come to be something other than and mutually exclusive of being a Jew? Is Paul here saying that he is no longer a Jew but a Christian? Christianity is not a word Paul uses, nor is the term Christian. Does Paul even know it? And if he knows it, does he like it? Had Paul quit Judaism in being a Jew, or is it more likely, as I argue and others do as well, that Paul traded in one way of living out his Jewishness for another way of living out his Jewishness, in light of his belief that Jesus was the Messiah? So it's not that his earlier life in Judaism is an abandonment of Judaism, but abandonment of one form of Jewishness for a new form of Jewishness. Okay? To begin to answer that question, we must look at the internal evidence of Paul's letters. Is there evidence within Paul's letters that he thinks he's no longer a Jew, or has abandoned this, or rejects it, or thinks it's somehow fatally flawed? Paul's letters repeatedly demonstrate a theological orientation that fits within the thoroughgoingly Jewish conceptual world. His God is unquestionably the God of Israel and the God of the Jews. He says so over and over. His sacred and authoritative texts are Jewish scriptures. His writings are filled with references to figures from Israel's history: Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Benjamin, Moses, and David. And of course, Paul is fixated on a messianic hope that is distinctively Jewish. Non-Jews uninfluenced by Jewish thinking didn't have a concept of the Messiah. This was something unique to ancient Jews, even if not all of them believed the Messiah was coming, and even if they debated what kind of Messiah was coming. Paul fits within this messianic hope that we don't know of outside of ancient Judaism. But beyond that, at numerous points in his letters, Paul stresses his own Israelite or Jewish identity. In Galatians, for instance, he recounts his disagreement with the Apostle Peter, in which he reminds Peter that they are both, and I quote, by nature or by birth, Jews, and not, and these are Paul's words, Gentile sinners, non-Jewish sinners. So he codes non-Jews as negative. For Paul, this distinction between Jew and non-Jew remains fundamental to his self-identity. In his hierarchy, as Pamela Eisenbaum notes, Paul clearly identifies himself as a Jew in his letters. Ironically, Paul is especially emphatic about his Jewish identity in Galatians, the letter often regarded as the most anti-Jewish of his writings. Elsewhere, he refers to himself as an Israelite, a seed of Abraham, and a Benjaminite. And in Philippians, demonstrating what he could put his confidence in if he so chose, Paul mentions that he was circumcised on the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and a Hebrew born to Hebrew parents. In addition to continuing to see himself as a Jew, Israelite, Hebrew, Paul repeatedly writes these things that imply he believed that Jews continued to enjoy divine privileges. For instance, when he poses the rhetorical questions, what advantage does the Jew have, or what is the value of circumcision? His immediate answer, perhaps quite surprisingly to many of his readers of the last 2,000 years, is much in every way. While he doesn't give us an extensive list at this point, he does mention that God has entrusted Jews with God's words. And later, in this same letter, Paul gives a lengthier list of privileges he believes still belong to Israel, regardless of their belief in Jesus. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Messiah. I just counted for the first time, it's 9. I've never done that before. 9 distinctive privileges that Israel still has in Paul's mind. Here Paul affirms the abiding validity of Israel's divine election, referred to as adoption, the presence of God referred to as glory, the various covenants God had made with them, the value of the Jewish law and the Jewish cultic system, referred to by the word the worship, affirming that God's promises to them are still in effect. Well, what about the Jewish law? Obviously a sticking point in Paul's letters. Well, Paul repeatedly cites the law as authoritative. To the Galatians, for instance, who are really wanting to get circumcised, or at least some guys there are, some men are in Galatia, he says to them, those who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? Clearly, the problem for Paul isn't that people in Galatia want to do the law, it's that they don't understand it properly. And to the Romans, Paul can claim that the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, just, and good. In short, there are a whole host of claims in Paul's letters that signal to us that Paul at least did not think of himself as a radical or an anomalous or a former Jew. Paul did not set out either to radically redefine Judaism, as some scholars have argued, nor to leave Judaism behind for something called Christianity. Paul was a Jew who believed that the Jewish Messiah had come, and that this Jewish Messiah was Jesus, and that this Jewish Messiah, Jesus, was crucified by the Romans, and that this crucified Jewish Messiah named Jesus was raised from the dead by the God of Israel. So when we think of Paul, and I think we should think of him, when we think of Paul, I think we should think of him as a Jew who believes he must be loyal to the Messiah, without thinking that this loyalty in any way sets him against Judaism, or the Jewish law, or his fellow Jews. Third, and perhaps the most central emphasis of those who seek to locate Paul within Judaism is taking seriously Paul's own self-identification, and his sense of vocation, I should say. He believes he is God's anointed envoy or ambassador. The word he uses is apostolos, and we just transliterate that as apostle, to non-Jews. That's his divine portfolio. He makes this claim repeatedly in his letter to the Romans. God has called him to be an envoy for the gospel, a proclamation meant to elicit the obedience of loyalty from all Gentiles. He tells the Romans that he desires to visit them so that he can declare the good news there, just as he has among the rest of the Gentiles, be they Greeks or barbarians. And when he discusses the fact that so many of his fellow Jews don't believe that Jesus is God's Messiah, he mentions again that, well, he's God's envoy to non-Jews, to Gentiles. And finally, at the close of the body of Romans, so this is over and over in his letter to the Romans, at the close of the body of Romans, he claims that he's God's public servant to the Gentiles. Similarly to the Galatians, Paul avers that God has set him apart, this is the quotation here, apart while he was in his mother's womb, and has revealed his son to Paul with the purpose that he would herald the good news of his son to Gentiles. It is here where we see Paul's gospel and self-perception relying on Jewish categories. Non-Jews didn't generally think of themselves as Gentiles, undifferentiated nations. This was a catch-all phrase that Jews used of non-Jews. And in Galatians 2, we hear Paul claiming the following. Modern translations sort of sanitize this a little bit, but I've tried to desanitize it. I have been entrusted with the gospel of the foreskin, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcision. For the one who worked through Peter, making him an envoy to the circumcised, or the circumcision, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. Jewish categories that divide up the human world. Jews and non-Jews, circumcised and foreskins. Glad that term didn't stick. When we read Paul's, there's a book that was just put entitled Paul, Apostles of Foreskin. I hope it's well read. I hope we don't use that title in everyday parlance. When we read Paul's letters, then, we must repeatedly remind ourselves that he writes them to readers who are predominantly, perhaps exclusively, non-Jewish. Paul's claims in his argument will only be misinterpreted if we misidentify his audience. And I am convinced that this is what has repeatedly happened throughout the history of interpretation of his letters. We must also remind ourselves that one of the key questions that Paul and other early followers of Jesus faced was the question of if and how non-Jews could be part of this new movement within Judaism. What, in other words, is the relationship between Gentiles, Israel, and Israel's God? And of course, the Jewish law. And it is here that the error of thinking about Judaism in monolithic terms becomes particularly problematic. Judaism didn't believe anything about Gentiles and deliverance. Jews, on the other hand, did, and they disagreed. And were in conflict, in competition with one another. These differing convictions all fit within the largest religious tradition that we now refer to as Judaism. When we modern readers encounter Paul's letters, and we see conflict between Paul and others about how exactly Gentiles were to relate to Israel's God, to Israel, and to Israel's laws, we are seeing a particular inflection and extension of a much broader conversation that Jews were involved in as they negotiated the ancient Mediterranean world. Further complicating this trend of thinking of ancient Judaism in monolithic terms is the connected issue of thinking about Judaism in distinctively Christian terms, at least for Christian readers of Paul. This is natural in some ways for those of us who are Christian. When we encounter something new or unfamiliar, it is easy to translate it for ourselves or relate it to things we know well. I'm going to give an example, and I forgot to ask beforehand because I didn't expect her to be here, related to my daughter. One of the first friends my daughter made in kindergarten was Jewish. She frequently came home fascinated by the different practices of her friend, and she would seek to translate those practices into ones that were more familiar to her. Her family would go to synagogue, which my daughter called their church. Her family celebrated Hanukkah, which my daughter thought of as Jewish Christmas, because of the time of year, and the food, and the gifts, and the lights. And we have a couple books that combine Hanukkah and Christmas stories together. What's understandable in a child is unhelpful in historical and religious studies. It's also unhelpful in ecumenical contexts, since virtually all readers of Paul's letters, at least until the last century, have been Christian. They almost automatically compare Judaism to Christianity and speak of Judaism in Christian terms. This is almost always a mistake, for several reasons, and it's unfair to Judaism, which, after all, was not and is not trying to be Christianity. One of the most common ways in which people mistakenly think about Judaism in Christian categories, especially in relation to Paul, is when it comes to ideas around conversion and missionizing. For many Christians, one faith requires that one share their faith with others. Now, there seem to have been some Jews who believe that non-Jews needed to undergo conversion and become Jews themselves in antiquity. But evidence for this position is actually quite limited and contested. If our sources are representative, missionizing of non-Jews was unusual. More common was a relatively laissez-faire approach to Gentiles. Israel's God was also the supreme God of the universe, and when in the future God brings about eschatological deliverance for Israel, he will somehow or other incorporate non-Jews. Most of the time, those visions are of non-Jews entering this salvation as non-Jews, streaming to Israel in God's temple, but still remaining non-Jews. This larger ancient Jewish debate of how exactly God would deal with non-Jews and how exactly they were to relate to them is where we need to situate any careful reading of Paul in his letters. Since Paul thought he was God's appointed ambassador to the Gentiles, central to his mission was the question of how God intended to incorporate Gentiles into God's salvation of Israel if the Messiah had now come. And it is this debate in the early Jesus movement that provides the context for most, if not all, of Paul's statements about the Jewish rite of circumcision and the Jewish law more broadly. What drives Paul's writings, then, is not some abstract theory of salvation, nor is it a theoretical commitment to universalism that fits with post-Enlightenment European sensibilities. Rather, Paul finds himself in the nitty-gritty reality of figuring out how to incorporate non-Jews into the Jesus movement, now that the ends of the ages have come. Paul and other Jesus followers vigorously argued over how to do this. It is quite clear that some early Jesus followers were convinced that Gentiles needed not only to believe in Jesus the Messiah, but also needed to adopt the Jewish law. And obviously, most centrally for men, non-Jewish men, was the rite of circumcision. Paul, on the other hand, belonged to a stream of Judaism that was convinced that most aspects of the Jewish law didn't actually apply to Gentiles, precisely because it was the Jewish law and only belonged to Jews. God had never intended for Gentiles to observe aspects of the Jewish law like circumcision or Sabbath or dietary laws. And this wasn't a denigration or wasn't intended to be a denigration of the Jewish law, far from it. In fact, Christine Hayes has suggested that Paul's own thinking demonstrates that he has an exclusivistic view of Gentile inclusion. They're included in the Jesus movement, but he forbids them from trying to keep the Jewish law or from trying to become Jews. Not just that he doesn't require it, he actually forbids it. They are incorporated, in other words, but it's always as latecomers and guests into what is fundamentally, in Paul's mind, a Jewish movement. These nitty-gritty debates about the Jesus movement, about how the Jesus movement was supposed to incorporate non-Jews into a Jewish movement, were connected to theological ideas, for sure. For Paul, any requirement that Gentiles take up the Jewish law, or any Gentile desire to do so, signaled a theological misunderstanding. A variety of them, probably. I'll focus on one here. To require others to change their ethnic identity, or to desire to change one's own identity, then makes a larger theological statement about God. Such changed behavior in the hopes of changing one's identity implies that God is the God of one ethnic group but not the other. One of the reasons Paul so vehemently condemns efforts to turn Gentiles into Jews is that it would then imply that God is the God of Jews only. And this is what he says in Romans 3:29 as he's trying to sort of tackle this issue. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. In Paul's day, the controversy raged not over the validity of being a Jew and following Jesus, but in being a Gentile and following Jesus. How could Gentiles join this movement as Gentiles and remain faithful to the Messiah? That controversy faded relatively quickly in the 2nd century, as the movement became predominantly a non-Jewish movement. And in so doing, or a movement, I should say, that was populated by non-Jews, maybe that's a little clearer. And in so doing, Paul's heated rhetoric about things like circumcision and the law and their applicability or usefulness for non-Jews was removed from this context and applied universally to all humans, including Jews. This extrapolation resulted in the de-Judaizing of the Apostle Paul, leading to both Christians and non-Christians concluding that Paul rejected and abandoned Judaism, finding some inherent failure or deep flaw in it that Christ fixed. It's such a misunderstanding of Paul that has led Christians and Jews to frequently conclude that Paul is a stumbling block of immovable proportions in ecumenical understanding and relations. I think it's high time for us to put Paul back where we initially found him, within the Judaism of the 1st century Mediterranean world, not against it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was well done. Thank you. Stimulating. We have a microphone that will be going around here as well. I'm going to offer you a. You want to sit here or you want to be at the podium?
I think stay there.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the chat. A way of framing this is, if Gentiles aren't to keep most of the Torah, what are they supposed to be doing?
What a great question. And so that's exactly right. That like most is really the operative word there. Because if you're worshiping the God of Israel, you're already doing some of the Jewish law, aren't you? Right? And there are like, Paul has sexual mores that are distinctively Jewish. And a whole set of beliefs that are distinctively Jewish, and we've sort of forgotten that, especially in Christian who forgets these are actually distinctively Jewish things that Christians have adopted, and then we just sort of Christianized them and forgot their sort of the Jewishness of them, especially in Paul's day. So, I mean, before I answer that, let me just back up and say, can you see how complicated or confusing this would have been to non-Jews? Join this essentially Jewish movement, worship the Jewish God, follow the Jewish Messiah. Here are these Jewish scriptures that are telling you what to do and believe, and I'm quoting them to you as authoritative. Oh, but, no, sorry, circumcision, stop now. Where's the cutoff line? That was a bad pun. When you write about circumcision, you say them repeatedly, and I don't like puns, but still. Where's the point at which, well, this is perfectly fine for all humans to do, and this is now not what Gentiles do? Very confusing, and I can see why Paul's little communities are struggling with this. So I think that's one of those questions that you would end up having to ask each, Jewish player in the ancient world. And for Paul, I think Paul would have had his own answer, but he never delineates it clearly. And so it's sort of an ad hoc response, I think. A number of scholars have suggested that what Paul and many ancient Jews held to is that non-Jews had to hold to something like ethical monotheism, which could map onto the later rabbinic idea of immortality laws. And so that's possible. But you don't get that nice, clear, careful delineation in Paul's writings along those lines. You do get something like that in the Acts of the Apostles, though. So that's my answer and non-answer.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? And if you please wait for the microphone to come up so people online can hear you as loud.
I could let him go first. I'm still formulating the thought.
Okay.
Thank you for this excellent overview of Paul in relation to Judaism and also the scholarship that has introduced the Jewish Paul. A couple of passages that I wanted to get your take on. So, one of the passages, this is a little least important, but pretty important. In Philippians 3, Paul enumerates a number of his qualifications as a Jew.
Yep.
Circumcised on the 8th day, Hebrew of Hebrews, people of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, and by law Pharisee.
Yeah.
Blameless with regard to the righteousness that comes through law. He then goes on to say that these things are Xenia, loss, and scrupula, whatever that is, loss, and passed away. And I wonder, what do you think he's doing when he says that?
Yeah.
Is that a repudiation of those Jewish categories, or is it simply a comparison? Saying, in comparison to this unsurpassable knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ, this is worthless, but it's still worth something.
Yeah, great question. So I would say, historically, the answer readers of Paul have given is that it's worthless, sort of just universally worthless. And, my rebuttal, and I'm not alone in this, would be to say, well, that doesn't seem much about Christ then, does it? If you consider all these other things worthless compared to Christ, you haven't said Christ is worth that much if he's better than worthless things. So let me give an example. My kids are in the crowd and I'll embarrass them some more. When I tell my kids I love them, and how much do I love them, I don't tell them I love them more than I love eggplant. Because I don't like eggplant at all. It's not a heartwarming thing. So what would I do? I tell them, all the money in the world is not enough. I wouldn't trade you for all the money in the world. And I think that's what Paul is saying here. So your second, interpretation is the right one. These things are highly valuable. I'm pointing to you all the things that I can point to as merit, but they don't compare to the splendor of the Messiah.
That's great. So the second passage is the more important one.
Yep.
You did a great job of describing Paul as a Jew generally, but the author of Luke Acts is confident that he can portray Paul as claiming identity as a Pharisee even at the end of his apostleship.
Yep.
So in Acts 23, he stands up and he says, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee on trial for my belief in the resurrection." Luke does not call Paul a Christian, but he does allow Paul to call himself a Pharisee. So do you think that Paul remained a Pharisee even as he was an apostle?
Great question. Let me hear. So this connects to this text, I think most clearly. So Paul does say in Philippians 3, yeah, I mean, is that I was a Pharisee or I am a Pharisee? And I think it's still, This, I have suggested Paul is leaving one form of Judaism for another form of Judaism. And I've never actually thought about it in relation to Acts, but I think that's really helpful because I think sometimes I have even just thought in my head, well, maybe Paul's thinking he's leaving the Pharisees. Because he talks about the ancestral traditions down here, which is sort of a nice little hint. He's talking about a Pharisaic way of life. But I don't know that that's right, that's like an abandonment of Phariseeism in its totality, but maybe one form of Phariseeism. Maybe can still hold to I'm a Pharisee, but I believe that the Messiah is here. Of course, in Acts, I mean, one of the key distinctions of the Pharisees is they believe in the resurrection. And that coincides really nicely with the way, which is what Luke calls this Jesus movement. And that's where they disagree with the Sadducees. And so, you might disagree with some Pharisaic practices, not that there's uniformity there either. There's diversity within the Pharisaic movement, but around the idea of resurrection, Paul's in agreement still with this sort of Pharisaic view. Pharisaic used, I always have to qualify it, used neutrally, descriptively, not gets often used in pop culture as a negative.
Thank you. We have some more questions on the floor, but I'll field one from the screen first, but if you want to get a sense of what those are. So here's a question. This has several parts. You can do it. So given that you put Paul firmly in Judaism, and you say there's a significant diversity of what means to be a Jew in the first century, at what point, by what criteria do you argue that early Christians after Paul or outside Judaism, especially Paul's kind of Judaism, to further ask is, if Paul was within Judaism, when those who followed him were not within Judaism, when does that happen? So how do you say Paul's within Judaism, but say someone like Leo of Sardis, 2nd century bishop, is outside of Judaism, or is he also inside of Judaism? Is Paul following Paul's Messiah and also trying to make sense of life using the Torah?
Yep. So, yeah, great set of questions.
It's the 2nd century.
Yeah. I always say the 2nd century is news, not history. That's when I started losing interest.
So you want to take the first part,
So I think part of it has to be, you're right, that's a great question in the sense of there are still these key points that they share in common with Paul. In Tertullian as well. And I have this Tertullian quote, I don't have it in a PowerPoint, about Galatians is written against Judaism. At some point, it becomes significant to these certain people within this movement that Paul's one of the earliest thinkers in, to start distinguishing between themselves and Jews, even as they're using their texts. And so I think it's, as soon as you see a group or a theologian trying to say, this is who we are and it's not you, they basically self-identify as being outside of Judaism. But then, of course, they have to have that pedigree, so they have to call themselves sort of the true or new Israel. But the difference there is Paul isn't saying there's no connection with, whatever term you want to use, ethnic or historical Israel. In Tertullian and others are saying things along those lines. Yeah.
So you're saying that some kind of connectivity with ethnic Israel is still important there?
I still hear using the word ethnic because it's such a complicated category. But as soon as Paul doesn't say Jews are out and only Christians are in. So as soon as you have that dichotomy of Jew-Christian as being mutually exclusive, I think you've put yourself and your group outside of Judaism intentionally. And Paul doesn't do that.
Thank you. I know we have a hand in the back, I believe. Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My question is, Paul strongly presents Christ as a Jewish Christ, mostly in his letters. So inclusion of Gentiles without going through the circumcision and trying to fulfill the blessings of Abraham, in the line of Abraham. And by accepting Christ, that you receive the blessings of Abraham.
Yeah.
So that can be a trigger point for Jewish people to not accept him as a Jewish. So how do you look at that?
So again, I think all this language, Galatians and Romans is where we hear about Abraham, mostly in Paul's letters. And Galatians, I think, is really a key point because, Paul talks about Christ, Messiah, as the seed of Abraham, in whom Gentiles get his blessing. And again, I think it's really important to keep in mind this is a conversation about how Gentiles get connected to Abraham. And this is something that John Levinson, in his really great book, Imitating Abraham, talks about. It's surprising in terms of the developments of later Christianity that for Paul, it's really important. Abraham is still important, and Abrahamic descent is really important. Being connected to Abraham is really important. Paul and his opponents are arguing over how Gentiles, non-Jews, get connected to Abraham. And for Paul's opponents, it's circumcision. Abraham believed in Genesis 15, and in Genesis 17 he gets circumcised. So any males in Galatia or elsewhere who are Gentiles who want to follow in the footsteps of Abraham and be Abrahamic sons and seed who get the blessing should follow Abraham. Believe, get circumcised. And Paul comes along and he says, no, that's just plastic surgery. That's cosmetic surgery. You're looking like Abraham, but you're not related to Abraham. You have to actually have a genealogical connection. And this is something I argue in my book. I think it's really fascinating and very weird, which is what makes it fascinating. Paul thinks that the Messiah is related to Abraham, and at the Messiah's resurrection, his spirit, his pneuma, goes out and it inhabits non-Jews. His stuff, the messianic stuff, lives in non-Jews, and that forges a pneumatic connection to the Messiah, and through that, all the way back to Abraham. So Abrahamic descent still matters, but Paul does it in a really innovative, unique way around really ancient science in some weird ways, but still always through, but it's still genealogical and it's still through the Messiah. And this is in relation especially to non-Jews, again, keeping that the focus of what Paul's talking about.
I would say that part of your argument is quite interesting. That's why you want to buy the book in the back or online for the discount code. So another question from online, and then we'll take a few other questions here. So what does Paul do with Jews who do not confess Jesus as Messiah and continue to keep the law? Where does it fall into this paragraph?
Yeah, so Romans 9 to 11. So I would say A, again, almost always Paul's not thinking about that. Or talks writing about it. He's probably often thinking about it. But he talks about it most explicitly in Romans 9 to 11. And some of the early Paul within Judaism people, before it was called Paul within Judaism, John Gager and Lloyd Gaston especially, thought the Messiah in Paul's mind is actually only for Gentiles. Jews are saved as Jews and they don't have to believe or relate to the Messiah. And that's become sort of like the predominant view of, exterior view of us inside this camp. And most of us don't buy it as much as we maybe partly want to, because it's nice ecumenically. And that'd be nice if Paul were so ecumenically minded. Paul's a first century Jew and not concerned about modern ecumenical discussion. So Romans 9 to 11, Paul makes it very clear that he wants, in hopes that Jews will believe that the Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah and has been raised from the dead. And he thinks they are temporarily, well, the language is tricky. Mark Nanos has something like, not broken off, but sort of bent off the tree, that's sort of the inheriting tree. And so Paul thinks that there's a sort of temporary gap, shocking, surprising gap in salvation history where many Jews don't believe, and it's actually something that the divine will has caused. So it's not like Jewish stubbornness or anything like that. It's actually God has done this because God realized, I need to get the Gentiles. And it's going to be a temporary thing. When the Gentiles come in, then the Jews will believe in the Messiah, and everything will end and be glorious. That's Paul writing, obviously, 20, 30 years after Jesus, thinking the end is coming very soon, and he thinks it's all going to come very quickly. I think that's Paul's faith. Yeah.
Thank you. I know I saw some other hands in the crowd here, so
Thank you, Professor. I understand in late rabbinic Judaism, as it developed, the word law, Torah, would be used not only for the books of Moses, but also for, you can say, the oral Torah, the authoritative rabbinic teaching. And so my question is about translating the word law in Paul's letters. Do you ever have the sense that, for example, when he uses the word law in negative statements, like when he says to the Corinthians, I think, to those under the law, I became as one under the law, even though I am not under the law. Do you think he's using that? Do you think it's possible that he's using that in the sense of oral Torah, in the sense that he's somehow claiming that he's received a revelation, and now he's no longer subject to anyone else's oral Torah, but even though he still is a Jew, in this relationship to Moses, that it's a statement about the authority of somehow the Torah that he has received and that he is delivering.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before in relation to 1 Corinthians 9, to those under the law. Became one under the law. So the Greek word is nomos, which is how the Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible rendered Torah. For good and for bad, it's maybe a little narrow. Translators make these decisions. And Paul sort of stuck with it, writing in Greek. I'm trying to think if there's evidence. I can't think of any place where I can see that, nomos here, Paul is meaning sort of Pharisaic or later interpretations of the law, in distinction to which, oral as opposed to written. When Paul talks about what I think is oral as opposed to written, he uses the traditions of the ancestors. I think is the language that's pretty explicitly suggesting this is sort of Pharisaic tradition around what it means to be a Jew and what it means to observe the law. I'm intrigued by that. I have to think about that some more. I can't think of anything that would make me think, that's where it's happening.
Thank you.
all right, I think we have time for one last question, so please.
Thank you. As I read the ancient history of a lot of things, I'm led to believe that there's a huge number of non-observant Jews in the Mediterranean, dead end of the Mediterranean, so on. That leads me sometimes to read some of the confusing stories in Paul's history in Acts, as if the Gentiles he's going to are religious Hellenized Jews. And every place he goes to meet the Gentiles, every town or whatever, first place he goes is the synagogue.
Yeah.
And that's, they're going to give him a good lead into the Hellenized community of Jews in that area. And they have many communities as well, Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, so, what counts in each community as this is what rightful law observance looks like? I think that differs, and in the diaspora, it would in different communities, right? You're going to have different traditions that build up. When you read Acts, at least the way I think Luke is thinking about it is, and we have evidence of this, we have non-Jews who are attending synagogues, which again shows the lie about Judaism as this exclusivistic religion that doesn't allow non-Jews in. They were participating in synagogues well before Paul. And that's where, at least according to Acts, that's where Paul's finding them. which of course makes sense that he could then talk to them intelligently, because they actually know something about Judaism. I'd need to think more about that. But I think at least in Luke's mind, these are non-Jews who are just God-fearers or sympathizers with Judaism and are lurking there, but they're sort of fertile ground because they have found a foundation that helps make sense of what's fundamentally a Jewish message. When Paul's talking to pagans in Athens, that they're just like, what are you talking about? It's too confusing because it's using categories that are so foreign because they aren't sort of primed in Jewish worldview or terminology.
Well, thank you very much. You've really opened up for us kind of this new horizon and ways of thinking about Paul within Judaism. So please join me in thanking